I've been using the new M4 iPad Pro for about 2 weeks now. I've mostly done the same things I used to do with my M1 iPad Pro from 3 years ago. I watch YouTube videos, browse the internet, answer emails, and listen to music. The experience is almost the same. The M1 iPad Pro was already very powerful, fast, and had great battery life. This new one is even better at the same things. I know it doesn't sound like an exciting review, but I've been thinking about some of the interesting choices Apple made with this iPad specifically. Some things weren't even talked about in rumors. They just appeared, and they weren't even mentioned in the keynote. But they are unusual and different. So, here are 5 of the most interesting choices Apple made with the iPad Pro. First, the new iPad Pro is thinner. We all knew that. It's an interesting choice because I thought we were done with making iPads thinner a few years ago. Nobody was really asking for thinner iPads, but maybe Apple noticed how people love the Samsung Galaxy Tab Ultra, including me. The Samsung Galaxy Tab Ultra is also incredibly thin. The iPad went from 6.4 millimeters thick, which was a bit thicker than Samsung's top tablet, to now being 5.1 millimeters thick, just slightly thinner than Samsung's. I'm not trying to start any rivalry, though. If you ask Apple, they'll probably say, it's the thinnest Apple product ever, which is already crazy. It's super thin. But I feel like Apple was just trying to find something to make this iPad stand out, to make it feel different from the last few generations. Now, there are rumors that Apple might do the same with next year's iPhone, focusing on making it thinner. Honestly, I can tell that this new iPad is thinner and lighter, especially since I've used the previous one a lot. When you put a case on the iPad, the difference in thinness is less noticeable. But making the iPad thinner also means there's less space inside. Strangely, the 11-inch iPad Pro M4 has a bigger battery than the last generation's 11-inch model. However, the new 13-inch iPad has a slightly smaller battery, almost the same size as last year's. Even with these changes, the battery life is still really good. It has great standby time and lasts long when you're using it. What stands out to me is that if Apple had kept the iPad the same thickness as last year, they could have made it with an even bigger battery, leading to an incredibly long battery life. With the efficiency of the M4 chip, it could have lasted a very long time, but instead, they chose to make it super thin and still keep the same solid battery life as always. I would have loved to see the first option, with a huge battery. But anyway, there are also a few other things missing from this iPad. Apple didn't mention it during the keynote, but they removed the ultra-wide camera. It's not a big deal, of course. The camera square still has a large cutout for the LiDAR sensor, so it looks like there could be 2 or 3 cameras. But in reality, it's just a single camera, LiDAR, and a flash. I was also curious if using magnet paper could reveal new details about the iPad's insides before Jarek took it apart. I knew that if the iPad is made thinner and smaller, the speakers would likely be affected and become smaller. Fun fact, magnet paper is a great way to see the magnets inside a device, and it also shows that the iPad Pro now has new, more circular quad speaker drivers instead of the rectangular ones from before. I've compared the speakers from this model to the last generation, and this one has a bit less bass. It's still loud and has some of the best speakers in any tablet, but with less room inside, the speakers can't be as bass heavy. As for the packaging, not much has changed. An iPad box is still just an iPad box, but there are 2 things worth noting. One change is that there are no more stickers in the box. So if you were hoping to collect them, sorry, Apple has removed them to reduce waste and avoid shipping extra items. However, they are still including a couple of things with every iPad. If you get a space gray iPad, you'll receive a black USB-C cable and a power brick with each iPad. It's true that they're still including a white 20-watt charging brick with the iPad, even though they stopped including bricks with the iPhone. Given the high price of the iPad, it would be nice if they included a faster charging brick and matched it to the color of the cable. Maybe that's nitpicking, but it would be a nice touch. Anyway, let's move on and talk about this computer aspect. The criticism of the iPad Pro for years has been that while it's incredibly powerful and well-made, it's still just an iPad. It does many of the same things as an iPad Air with only a few extra features like pencil hover. Apple isn't letting the iPad Pro become a full-fledged computer, as they have Macs to protect. So it remains an extremely powerful iPad. And with this generation, that's still the case. This is the first time Apple is introducing the new M4 chip, and it's currently only in the iPad Pro. It's even more powerful at its peak and benchmarks extremely well. It uses a second-generation 3-nanometer process and has a larger, more powerful neural engine. The chip is impressive, but there are very few things that actually take advantage of its full power. Some features, like the new Final Cut app, are coming later this year. So if you use the iPad for typical tasks like watching Netflix or browsing the web, it will feel very similar to the last M1 iPad Pro or even the M1 iPad Air. With the M4 version, you can play one of the 3 games that support the new hardware-accelerated ray tracing on this iPad. You can use the new Stem Splitter feature and the Logic Pro 2 app for iPad, which looks amazing if you use Logic on the iPad. However, the most interesting new thing about the M4 chip, to me, is something Apple didn't really highlight. They briefly mentioned it during the keynote and don't show it clearly on their website. In the past, when buying an iPad, you mostly paid more for extra storage. You'd start with 128 gigabytes, which wasn't much, and then pay more for higher storage options. You could also choose different colors. A few years ago, it became clear that the highest-end models had more RAM as well. So if you bought more storage, you also got more RAM. Previously, you got 8 gigabytes of RAM on the base iPads and 16 gigabytes on the 1 and 2 terabyte iPad Pros. With the latest model, there's now a difference in CPU cores as well. The base iPad Pro now starts at 256 gigabytes of storage. The base versions have an 8-core CPU, while the top 2 versions come with a 9-core CPU, adding an extra performance core. The top 2 iPad Pro versions have 10-core CPUs instead of 9-core ones. There's also a nano texture display option, which has a matte finish. I briefly saw it at the event and it looked impressive, though I do have some concerns about its durability. The anti-reflective finish is only available on the top 2 options, the 1 and 2 terabyte iPad Pros. So if you buy a more expensive iPad Pro, you get different amounts of RAM, different CPU cores, different storage options, and different display options. It's starting to feel very computer-like. The tandem OLED display is the most interesting new feature under the hood of this iPad Pro. However, in practice, it's really just a slightly brighter and more contrasty version of the display we've had for years. A good example of how the iPad's hardware outpaces its software is the new OLED display. It would be impressive if the iPad had an all-black background with just the time showing, especially if it had an always-on display. However, the iPad doesn't have an always-on display right now. I wouldn't be surprised if the next version of iPadOS supports an always-on display for the Pro models since they now have OLED screens. We'll have to wait until WWDC to see if that feature is introduced. Aside from that, the new display has less blooming, making HDR content with true blacks look better. However, if you're just watching regular SDR content or doing everyday tasks like watching Netflix, checking emails, or browsing the web, you probably won't notice a big difference unless you're in direct sunlight at maximum brightness. That really shows how good iPad Pro displays have been for years. For artists, there's a new pencil as well. The back still doesn't act as an eraser, which would be nice, but the rest of the pencil is improved. It now supports Find My and has a new squeeze sensor for selecting different tools. The new pencil is very intuitive to use right away. It also has a new haptic motor, so you can feel a little click when you squeeze it, which is a nice touch for confirmation. I'm surprised they didn't add this feature sooner. It also supports barrel rotation for certain tools, changing how the point behaves when you rotate it. Plus, It even has a fake shadow effect. The shadow on the display is a fake computer-generated effect that matches the tool you're using and its rotation in real time. It's a bit unnecessary and just adds to the look. Instead of calling it the updated Apple Pencil, Apple is selling the old one at the same price and calling this new one the Pencil Pro. And, just to be clear, I am not an artist. I'm definitely not the target audience for this, but if you find these features tempting, you'll need to buy a whole new iPad to use them. That was intentional. They've moved the camera to the landscape side of the iPad, which is great, because that's where we wanted it to be all along. The Face ID array is now there too, and it's an ultra-wide camera for FaceTime and other uses. However, this is also where the Pencil has always attached and charged magnetically. They had to rearrange the internal components to make room for both the camera and the Pencil in the same place. The Pencil still attaches to the top as before. It seems they could have placed the Pencil on one side and the camera on the other, but instead, they kept the Pencil in the middle where it always has been. I used magnet paper on the back and confirmed that Apple changed the magnet layout inside. I tried pairing the new Apple Pencil Pro with my old iPad Pro, and while it sort of stuck on, it didn't actually pair or do anything. I'm personally not buying one of these new M4 iPad Pros because I already have a relatively new M1 iPad and don't need an upgrade. But if you don't have a recent iPad, this new model is definitely worth considering. It's better than ever, but we're all waiting for WWDC later this year to see what new features iPadOS will bring. We're hoping for something really interesting that takes full advantage of the new hardware. Other than that, it's pretty similar to the last few generations of the iPad Pro,